before we dive into this incredible story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, you'll find real cases told with depth, respect, and a human perspective. If this kind of content speaks to you, you're in the right place. She was born like any other average American girl, in a small town with quiet streets, modest schools, and neighbors who greeted each other in the morning. Nothing in her childhood suggested that, years later, she would become the youngest woman ever sentenced to the most feared punishment in the American justice system. Her name wasn't known outside of her hometown. Among classmates, she was seen as quiet but kind. Teachers described her as smart, though often distracted, and neighbors called her polite but distant. She was the kind of girl who could have gone unnoticed her entire life. And maybe that's exactly what she wanted, but there was something in her eyes, a silent restlessness, as if she carried more weight than she should at her age. It wasn't rebellion nor apathy. It was as if she were always waiting for something or running from it. At 15, she began to change. Her habits shifted. She stopped hanging out in the usual places, distanced herself from longtime friends, painted her once colorful room in darker tones, and replaced notebooks with scraps of paper filled with strange symbols and cryptic thoughts. Her parents, though present, didn't seem to notice the signs. Maybe out of fear, maybe denial. After all, what parent wants to believe their own child is slowly slipping away? But she wasn't crying for help, and maybe that's why no one heard her. During high school, she met new people. Some had difficult life stories. Others carried an almost seductive defiance toward the world. She found it all fascinating. For the first time, she felt like she belonged. She had attention. She had someone who said, "I understand you," and that, for an emotionally fragile teenager, can be more dangerous than any direct threat. Before long, she was involved in places her old friends couldn't even imagine, from secret parties to online forums, from late-night escapades to small acts of freedom that slowly left marks. The ordinary girl from before was starting to vanish, replaced by someone harder and harder to recognize. But the question that still lingers is, was this transformation spontaneous or orchestrated? Was she the mind behind the decisions, or was she merely being led, unknowingly, by invisible hands that knew exactly where they were taking her? In the next chapters, we'll uncover how this young woman went from complete anonymity to national headlines, not for an admirable feat, but for becoming the face of one of the most controversial and high-profile convictions in recent U.S. history. For a long time, she was just another young girl trying to find her place in the world. But like so many stories marked by silent tragedies, hers didn't change overnight. It was a slow, almost invisible process, as if the fall had started long before anyone noticed. Gradually, the signs began to build up. Skipping school, sudden mood swings, an increasingly distant look in her eyes. She started spending more time out than at home, often without explaining where she'd been. And when she was home, she'd lock herself in her room with the lights off, consumed by an unsettling silence. But none of that seemed to alarm the adults around her. Some chalked it up to just a teenage phase. Others simply didn't want to get involved. And it was in that silence, in that absence of presence and attention, that she got close to the wrong people. People who didn't offer help, but rather validation for her most dangerous impulses. That's when she met him. We won't name him just yet, but know this. That meeting changed everything. He was older, more experienced, at least on the surface, and he knew exactly how to earn the trust of someone emotionally vulnerable. With sweet words, promises of freedom, and the classic line, "No one understands you like I do," he became the voice she listened to most. Slowly, he replaced her parents, teachers, and friends. She began following his lead, admiring his ideas, agreeing with everything, even when those ideas started to flirt with legality. At first, it was just talk. What if we ran away? What if we handled things our way? But the line between imagination and reality started to blur when those conversations turned into concrete plans with dates, locations, and steps. His influence wasn't forced. It was gradual. It was seductive. He didn't push, he guided. And she, craving direction, followed. She started hanging out in dangerous places, joining shady meetups, and getting involved with people who saw the world through the lens of anger and disillusionment. And in that universe, the idea of getting back at the system started to make sense. After all, for someone who felt invisible, any offer of protagonism, even destructive, could feel like liberation. The plan started small, an act of rebellion, a way to show she was no longer the naive girl people remembered. But like any path poorly chosen, what began as an emotional outburst turned into a journey with no return. By the time she realized it, she was in too deep, and maybe out of pride, maybe out of fear, she couldn't back out anymore. It was as if somehow that new version of herself had finally come alive, and abandoning it would mean admitting it was all a mistake. This is where the story splits, because from this point forward, the girl searching for a place in the world will become the youngest defendant ever to face a courtroom under the weight of the law's most severe sentence. It all seemed like just another wild idea whispered in the heat of youth, until the day it stopped being just talk and became a plan. What had once been scattered words and impulsive late-night conversations was now organized in detail, where, when, how, and most importantly, why, they believed they were in control, that they knew exactly what they were doing. It was as if every step was justified by their own distorted logic, twisted, yet coherent inside the bubble they were living in. For her, it still felt like something temporary, an extreme experience that would eventually end and return to normal. But that illusion wouldn't last long. The chosen night arrived, and there was no turning back. The stage was set, his voice still echoing in her mind like whispered commands, not force, but deeply influential. Adrenaline mixed with fear, hesitation with excitement. She still had doubts, but now she carried something heavier than uncertainty, a sense of belonging. For the first time, she felt part of something bigger than herself, and that was addictive. They met discreetly. They carried ordinary objects, but with intentions that were anything but ordinary. Dark clothes, gloves, phones turned off. It felt like they were acting out a script, and maybe they were, a script whose ending she wouldn't truly understand until it was far too late. The location seemed harmless. A simple house, with few rooms and a predictable routine. That very predictability made everything easier and crueler. She hesitated at the door, took a deep breath, thought about leaving. But when she looked to the side and saw his eyes, firm, determined, with not a trace of doubt, she swallowed her fear and stepped inside. What happened inside the house remains, to this day, tangled in conflicting versions. She claimed she didn't know what was going to happen, that she thought it was only meant to be an act of intimidation, that they'd go in, take something, and leave. But the evidence told a different story. There were records, traces, details that pointed to premeditation, coordination, and cold intent. Authorities would later state that none of it had been accidental. Inside that house, everything changed. There were no screams, no chance to run, only silence, a silence that, ironically, would scream forever in the memory of those who investigated the case. When they walked out, she was no longer the same. Neither of them was. And if there had once been any illusion that it was just a symbolic act, it was now clear they had crossed an invisible line, one that, once passed, had no return, and the world as they knew it no longer existed. The days that followed were filled with rising tension. As the news began to spread, she tried to act normal. She went to school, replied to messages, smiled in photos. But inside, something had already broken. She kept telling herself no one would find out, that she'd been careful, that life could go on. But that thought didn't last long. Investigators soon began putting the pieces together. Security camera footage, intercepted conversations, anonymous tips, small mistakes that, when combined, form a precise puzzle. And in no time, her name was no longer just another one on a class list. It began showing up in police reports, in news broadcasts, in the whispers of the town. She was no longer just the different girl. She was now the face of one of the most shocking cases the juvenile justice system had ever faced. The girl who once dreamed of becoming an artist or maybe a teacher now carried on her shoulders the weight of a sentence that would change her life, and the way an entire country viewed justice, accountability, and youth. When the first reports began to circulate, The town was still in a state of denial. No one wanted to believe that something so disturbing could have happened there. In a place where time seemed to move slower and where almost everyone knew each other by name. Local authorities were the first to arrive, but they quickly realized this wasn't a case for routine procedures. Within hours, the house was surrounded by seasoned investigators, forensic teams, crime scene photographers, and journalists eager for any detail. Suddenly, the home was no longer just a residence. It had become the center of a national mystery. Evidence started to surface gradually. Partial footprints near the back entrance, a glove dropped by the gate, fresh tire tracks on the dirt road leading up to the house. Inside, objects out of place, doors left open, drawers pulled out, and a silence that seemed to weigh on every inch of the floor. But what struck the investigators the most was the level of precision. Nothing appeared random. While the forensic team collected what they could, another unit began digging through social media accounts, archived messages, call logs, and security footage from the surrounding area. That's when the names began to appear, names that, until then, hadn't crossed anyone's mind, and among them, hers. At first, her connection to the case seemed like a stretch, but as new information emerged, the clues became increasingly hard to ignore. A gas station camera captured a car similar to the one described by an anonymous witness. Hours later, another video showed someone wearing clothes identical to those she had worn in recent photos. Coincidences? Maybe, but a pattern was beginning to take shape. The turning point came with a tip-off. Someone, whose identity remains confidential, approached authorities and claimed that she had made strange comments days earlier. Remarks about a plan, about proving a point, about showing she wasn't just an ordinary girl. From that moment, the investigation accelerated. Police secured a warrant and searched her home. There, they found additional evidence. Clothes hidden in the back of the closet, an old phone with no SIM card, a notebook filled with scattered phrases, symbols, and a to-do list that eerily aligned with the events of that night. It didn't take long before she was brought in for questioning. Sitting across from the investigators, she appeared calm, maybe rehearsed, maybe in shock. The questions were direct. She answered with short, measured responses. She avoided detail. Sometimes she looked away. Other times, she stared straight ahead with a coldness that unsettled the room. She denied any involvement, said she didn't know anything, that she was home, that she went to bed early. But the evidence was stacking up and becoming too heavy to dismiss. When she was confronted with the footage, the records, the anonymous tip, and the objects found in her room, silence filled the room. She lowered her eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time hesitated. She didn't confess, but she no longer denied with the same conviction. In that moment, it seemed clear that the version of the story she had built was no longer strong enough to protect her. Meanwhile, the other individual involved was already being tracked down in another city, hundreds of miles away. The two would soon face each other, no longer as partners in a secret plan, but as co-defendants in an investigation that was only beginning to expose its true depth. The following weeks were filled with new discoveries. Screenshots of encrypted conversations, witnesses who suddenly remembered key details, deleted messages recovered through digital forensics. Each new piece of information pointed to something larger, darker, more coordinated. This was no longer just about a troubled teenager. She was becoming the central figure in a case that many would later say redefined the national debate on youth, criminal accountability, and emotional influence. And perhaps the most disturbing part of it all was a lingering question behind every word, every gesture, every silence from her. Was she the mastermind behind it all, or simply the most visible face of a story much deeper than we can see? The courtroom was packed. People standing, journalists set up with cameras aimed at every face, and curious onlookers try and catch a glimpse of anything they could, even from a distance. For many, this wasn't just a trial, it was a spectacle. And she, seated at the defendant's table, was at the center of it all. The prosecution came in strong from the very beginning. They presented evidence, testimonies, footage, records, and a cohesive narrative built piece by piece, like a puzzle being assembled right in front of the jury. The prosecutor spoke with conviction. He held up a journal, read excerpts from recovered messages, replayed surveillance videos, and called witnesses who had interacted with her in the days leading up to the crime. Every word felt like another nail being hammered into conclusion that many had already drawn. Full guilt. The defense, on the other hand, took a different approach. They didn't deny her involvement. They aimed to explain it. They tried to show that this young woman wasn't a cold monster, but someone emotionally fragile, shaped by toxic relationships, external pressures, and a troubled past that had remained invisible until now. They brought in psychologists, former teachers, childhood friends. They spoke of her early years, of the lack of emotional stability, of episodes of isolation and self-harm. The objective was clear: to humanize her, to get the jury to see that behind the brutal facts, there was a lost, broken girl who no longer knew how to distinguish right from wrong. But the jury wasn't there just to listen. They were there to decide. And what unfolded before them was a duel of narratives, one rooted in logic and evidence, the other in emotion and the soul. She, meanwhile, remained composed throughout most of the proceedings, head down, eyes fixed, expression unreadable. Some called it coldness. Others saw it as self-preservation. But there was a moment that broke that pattern, when one of the prosecution's witnesses read aloud an excerpt from her journal, a line where she had written, "I've never felt more alive than I did that night." She finally reacted. Her eyes welled up with tears. She bit her lip and seemed to struggle to stay composed. It was brief, but everyone saw it. And in that moment, the public became even more divided, between those who saw her as heartless and those who now saw a young woman consumed by guilt. The trial dragged on for days. Each testimony felt heavier than the last. The footage was played and replayed. Questions were asked again, this time with sharper tone. But in the end, everyone knew that what was at stake went far beyond a verdict. This was a trial about how society deals with its youth, with their mistakes, and with their emotional wounds. When the judge asked for silence to announce a decision, the room froze. She remained still, as if refusing to give the world the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. Guilty, sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed for her age. The youngest woman, technically still a girl, to receive such a sentence in recent years. The reactions were immediate. Some applauded, others cried. The press rushed to break the news. And her? She simply lowered her eyes. For the first time, she seemed to fully grasp the weight of it all. There were no more arguments, no more control, only silence. The same silence that would follow her for years in the place where she was headed. In that courtroom, it wasn't just a verdict that came to an end. It was a youth, a cycle, a story that never had a happy ending. But something else began there, something that would outlive the courtroom walls. A debate about where influence ends and responsibility begins, about how far you can serve as an excuse or a sentence, and about what we as a society truly do when we let our children become adults by force, without reaching out a hand before it's already too late. She didn't cry when the sentence was read. She didn't stand up. She didn't scream. She simply lowered her eyes and stayed silent, as if the weight of the decision was still sinking in. But at that moment, one thing was certain: the life she once knew was over. There would be no more school, no social media, no friends nearby, or weekend routines. Now, everything came down to a cell, a gate, a uniform, and the sound of doors that only opened from one side. In the days that followed, the media dissected every piece they could find. Old photos, childhood videos, testimonies from classmates, comments from neighbors. The entire country seemed to have an opinion about her. Some called her a monster, others, a victim of a broken system. But for the justice system, labels didn't matter, only what she did. The juvenile detention center she was sent to was cold, strict, designed for rehabilitation, but not for comfort. Inside, she was watched constantly. Her steps, her schedule, her reactions. The staff knew who she was. So did the other girls. And no one seemed indifferent to her presence. At first, she tried to maintain the same neutral expression she had shown in court, but the daily routine slowly chipped away at any illusion of control. She woke up early, ate what was served, attended mandatory sessions, sat through lectures, pretended to listen. But at night, alone in that small, windowless room, The mask dropped, and for the first time, she faced something she couldn't manipulate: time. Because inside those walls, time drags. There are no distractions strong enough, no promises, no escape. There's only the daily confrontation with everything you did and everything you could have done differently. She began to write, notebooks full, about feelings, memories, anger, regret, about the night that changed everything, about the boy who convinced her, about the world that ignored the warning signs. Some pages read like apologies, others like veiled confessions, but all of them carried the same weight, a silent scream from someone who realized, far too late, the depth of the hole she had fallen into. Outside, time moved on. Her story turned into documentaries, TV series, opinion pieces. But oddly, no one really knew how she was doing. The media moved on. People forgot. But she remained day after day, month after month, aging inside a story she could no longer rewrite. Over time, her face changed. The once hard stare now carried a deep fatigue. She was no longer the girl who shocked the country. She was just another young woman who arrived far too early in a place no one should ever have to be. And this is where the question starts to echo, through hallways, files, whispered conversations among the guards. Did she pay enough? Or was she just another lost teenager, judged through adult eyes, sentenced for mistakes that may not have been hers alone? The answer, like almost everything about this case, divides opinion. Some say the punishment was fair. Others believe the real failure happened long before the trial. What's undeniable is that the consequences didn't stop at the cell door. They spread to the families, to the justice system, to a society that watches but often doesn't understand. Because deep down, her story isn't just about guilt. It's about absence, and about the price we all pay when no one gets there in time. She was 17, maybe 18, and as much as many argue that by that age, you already know what you're doing, the truth is not everyone reaches adulthood the same way. Some mature early, others survive the best they can, and some simply don't have enough time to learn what's right before making the one mistake that changes everything. Her case isn't simple. It never was, because it exposes wounds that go far beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, beyond the uniform she now wears. It's a story that forces us to face uncomfortable questions, the kind we avoid because we know how much they implicate us as a society. Where were the adults when the first signs appeared? Where were the teachers, the parents, the friends, the protection systems? How can someone change so much for so long without anyone stopping it? Maybe that's the cruelest part of the entire story. Not what she did, but everything that came before, all the days she was ignored, all the warning signs brushed off as teenage drama, all the conversations that never happened. Because despite what many believe, no one hits rock bottom overnight. The fall is long, almost always silent, and almost always invisible until it's too late. She committed a crime. She was judged. She was sentenced. But the question that really hurts, the one that sticks in our throats, is, was she truly alone in that guilt? Or was she carrying, along with her own mistakes, the weight of an entire web of absence? Her face made headlines. But how many similar stories are unfolding right now? Invisible, silent, slowly heading toward the same fate. How many other young girls are, at this very moment, being pushed slowly toward the edge, while everyone around them pretends everything's fine? Her case may seem isolated, but in truth, it's a mirror, a distorted, painful reflection of what happens when we fail to see what's right in front of us. And that's why it keeps being told. That's why it still unsettles. That's why it still divides opinion. Because deep down, this isn't just her story. It's the story of an entire generation that grew up alone, and that learned in the worst way possible that sometimes the biggest mistake is the silence of those who should have done something. Now that you've heard the full story, I want to ask you, what's your opinion? Do you believe she deserved the sentence she received? Or do you see something deeper in this case? Something that goes beyond individual guilt? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them, and I truly want to know what you think. If this video moved you in any way, like it, Share it with someone who needs to reflect on this. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, we keep telling real stories that don't just inform, they transform. Because sometimes what's truly haunting isn't the crime itself, but everything that happens before it.